We've all been sold a lie. The fairy tales speak of gleaming white towers, noble knights, and golden banquets. But the stones tell a much darker story. In the belly of the castle, where torchlight cannot reach and the air tastes of centuries, the walls weep. Not with sorrow, though there is sorrow here, but with condensation that runs in dark rivulets down limestone faces, pooling in crevices worn smooth by water and time. This moisture smells of iron and rot, of things breaking down in the absence of sun, of organic matter returning to its elemental state. This is not the gleaming fortress sung about in great halls, not the romantic stronghold of tapestries and tournaments. This is the truth beneath the pageantry, the foundation upon which all that glittering nobility rests. Here, in passages carved into living rock, waste flows through channels designed with the same engineering precision as the castle's defensive walls. Chamber pots are emptied into chutes that pierce through multiple floors, spilling their contents down the outer walls in streams that stain the limestone with centuries of human necessity. The marks are permanent, dark streaks like tears on the face of the fortress, visible to anyone who knows to look, invisible to those who choose not to see. A servant girl moves through these passages in the hour before dawn, when darkness is at its thickest and the castle's secrets feel closest to the surface. Her bare feet make no sound on floors slick with things she learned long ago not to name, not to think about, not to let herself imagine too clearly. She carries a wooden bucket, its contents sloshing with each careful step, and the rhythm of this descent is as familiar to her as breathing. As familiar as the prayers she whispers under her breath, not to ward off evil, though there is evil here, but to keep the darkness at bay. To remind herself that she is still human, still seen by God, even in this place where no one else sees her at all. The castle keeps its secrets in layers, like sediment accumulating on a riverbed. In the kitchens, where fires burn perpetually and the heat is almost unbearable even in winter, the cook's assistant scrapes spoiled meat into the flames. The flesh has gone green at the edges, soft with decay, but there is an art to salvaging what can be salvaged. The smell of rot is masked by rosemary and burning fat, by the aggressive smoke of green wood thrown onto the fire. By morning, no one will remember what went into the pot. No one will ask. 3 floors above, in chambers hung with silk dyed in colors that cost more than a peasant family earns in a lifetime, the lady of the house kneels beside her bed. Her hands shake as she conceals blood-stained linens beneath her mattress, pushing them deep into the straw where her maids will not look. Evidence of a pregnancy that must not be spoken of, not yet, perhaps not ever. The blood could mean many things. It could mean loss. It could mean sin. It could mean both. She does not know who to pray to for guidance in this moment, so she prays to no one, her lips moving in silence while her heart hammers against her ribs like something trying to escape. Down the corridor, behind a carved wooden screen in an alcove that smells of incense and old breath, the castle confessor sits in permanent shadow. His face has been creased into deep lines by the weight of other people's shame, canyons carved by years of listening to what can never be unheard. He collects sins like a miser collects coins, hoarding them in the vault of his memory where they accumulate interest. He knows about the stable boy found dead in the hay, his neck broken in a way that suggests falling but could just as easily suggest something else. He knows about the bread mixed with sawdust to stretch the stores through a winter that has lasted too long. He knows about the Lord's brother who has not left his tower room in 3 months, attended only by a mute servant who brings him wine mixed with opium and honey, who empties his chamber pot and asks no questions and tells no tales. The confessor knows these things because people tell him, because confession is sacrament and secrets must have somewhere to go. But he wonders sometimes if knowing is the same as absolution, if the weight he carries serves any purpose beyond his own gradual destruction. These walls were built to protect, but they also conceal. Every great hall has its hidden staircase, spiral passages built into the thickness of the stone. Every chapel has its crypt, chambers beneath chambers where the dead are stacked like cordwood. And in the spaces between stone and mortar, in the gaps where mice nest and spiders spin elaborate architectures of silk, the castle holds its breath and remembers everything. Every scream that echoed through these corridors. Every prayer whispered in desperation. Every lie told to preserve what cannot be preserved. The servant girl reaches the bottom of the stairs, her bucket heavy in her aching hands. She pushes open the iron grate with her shoulder, metal scraping against stone in a sound that seems obscenely loud in the pre-dawn silence. Beyond it, the river waits, dark and forgiving, moving with the patient inevitability of all natural things. The water will carry away what the daylight must never see. It always has. It always will. She tips the bucket and watches the contents disappear into the current, dissolved and dispersed and made invisible. And somewhere above her, the castle begins to wake. The garderobe is a small mercy built into stone, a shaft that drops 3 stories down through the castle's body, opening to the moat or the hillside below, where everything dissolves into earth and water and the slow alchemy of time. The nobles call it a privy, speaking the word with the delicate distance that wealth affords. The servants call it a chute, which is closer to the truth, a functional passage for waste, nothing more. The castle architect who designed it 2 centuries ago called it necessity, and perhaps that is the most honest name of all. But on winter mornings, when frost crystallizes on the wooden seat in patterns like frozen flowers and the wind howls up through the shaft with a voice that sounds almost human, it becomes something else entirely. A reminder that even power cannot escape the body's insistence on humiliation. That beneath the velvet and the titles and the elaborate fiction of divine right, there is only flesh, ordinary, demanding, indifferent to status. The Lord sits here sometimes in the hours before dawn, his ermine-trimmed robe pulled tight against the cold that rises from below like the breath of the earth itself. His hands shake, though whether from cold or age or something deeper he cannot say. In this moment, alone in the dark with wind and stone, he thinks about dignity. About what it costs to maintain the fiction of it. About how much of his life has been spent performing a role that no one, not even God, truly believes in anymore. The castle's true industry happens in places the nobility never sees. Beneath the great hall, in chambers carved into bedrock that never feel sunlight, never know the warmth of day, the laundresses work in perpetual twilight. Steam rises from great vats of boiling water, turning the air thick and hot and hard to breathe. The women move through this fog like ghosts, their faces red and slick with moisture, their hands cracked and bleeding from the caustic bite of lie. They scrub evidence from linen, evidence of feasts and illnesses and indiscretions, transforming soiled cloth into spotless sheets that will grace the tables and beds of their betters by supper. The transformation is their art and their burden. These women know things that would shatter dynasties. They know which stains are wine and which are not, which marks on fabric tell stories of pleasure and which speak of violence. They know the Marchioness has not bled in 4 months, though her husband has been away at war for 6. They know the young knight who returned from crusade carries scars that weep yellow fluid, infection eating him from the inside out while he maintains the fiction of wholeness at court. They know the visiting bishop requires his sheets changed 3 times daily, that he burns incense constantly to mask a smell that comes not from his surroundings but from within his own decaying flesh. The laundresses speak little among themselves. Words are dangerous, and they have learned to communicate in glances and gestures, in the careful choreography of shared labor. Their silence is purchased with bread and a corner to sleep in, with the promise of survival in a world where homelessness means death. They understand that knowledge is currency, but it is currency they can never spend without destroying themselves in the transaction. In the cellars, beyond the wine casks and the game hanging from iron hooks, deer and boar slowly aging in the cool darkness, there is a room without windows where the castle physician keeps his instruments. The door is always locked. The air inside smells of vinegar and copper and something sweeter, something that clings to the back of the throat and lingers long after you've left. Saws for bone rest on wooden tables, their teeth still stained from their last use. Cups for bleeding are stacked in precise rows, each one marked with measurements no one but the physician understands. Jars of leeches writhe in murky water, their bodies coiling and uncoiling in rhythms that seem almost purposeful. This is where the body's failures are confronted, where illness and injury are met with instruments of metal and methods passed down through generations of men who learned to cut away rot before it spreads. The physician treats plague and poison with equal discretion. When the Lord's food taster begins vomiting blood, retching into a basin while his skin takes on the gray pallor that precedes death, the physician asks no questions. He administers what he can, charcoal, milk, prayers, and documents nothing. When a servant girl is carried in with injuries from a fall down the stairs, bones broken in patterns that suggest she was pushed rather than stumbled, he sets what can be set and sends her back to work and writes nothing in his ledger. He learned long ago that his survival depends not on healing, but on forgetting, on knowing when to look away, on understanding that some truths are more dangerous than any poison in his collection. The castle keeps grinding forward, day after day, built on secrets that everyone knows and no one speaks. There are places in the castle where sound travels strangely, where a whisper in one chamber can be heard perfectly in another 3 floors away, carried through hidden channels in the stone like secrets traveling through veins. The castle's original mason knew this when he laid the foundation. He built listening tubes into the walls with the same careful attention he gave to the arrow slits and murder holes. Passages for voices to carry from the bedchamber to the council room, from the chapel to the treasury, from anywhere power might speak to anywhere power might need to hear. The current lord's grandfather discovered them by accident 40 years ago, running his hand along a wall in search of a draft and finding instead a small opening concealed behind a tapestry. He pressed his ear to the cold stone and heard his wife's voice, clear as if she stood beside him, speaking 2 floors below. Since that moment he has been listening. Every night, moving through the castle's hidden geography, his ear pressed to carved channels, collecting secrets like a miser hoards gold. He knows about the affair between his daughter and the falconer, has heard their whispered promises in the mews where hawks sleep hooded on their perches. He knows the steward is skimming from the household accounts, pocketing silver coins and altering the ledgers with a practiced hand. He knows his eldest son prays each night for his father's death, kneeling beside his bed with clasped hands, asking God to speed the old man's departure from this world. The grandfather finds this neither surprising nor particularly hurtful. He prayed the same prayers about his own father once. These walls have always been designed for surveillance, for the quiet accumulation of leverage and shame. Knowledge is power here, and power is the only thing worth having. But the dungeons are not where most suffering happens. That dark honor belongs to the upper floors, where reputation must be maintained and appearances preserved at any cost. Where pain must be endured in silence, behind closed doors, with composed faces and careful words. The dungeons are for criminals and enemies, for those who have already lost everything. The upper chambers are for those who must continue pretending they have not. In the Lady's Solar, where afternoon light falls through narrow windows in pale shafts, a young woman sits with her embroidery frame. Her face is composed into perfect serenity, the expression she has practiced since childhood, the mask of contentment that noble women wear like armor. Her maid kneels beside her chair, applying a poultice to the bruises that bloom like dark flowers across her ribs, purple and yellow and the deep red-black of burst blood vessels beneath skin. No one will ask about them. No one will intervene. The servants who dress her each morning see the marks and say nothing, their eyes carefully averted. Her mother-in-law who visits each afternoon sees them when the gown slips and looks away, her mouth pressed into a thin line that could be disapproval or could be resignation. Marriage is a sacrament, holy and unbreakable, and what happens within its bonds is God's business, not man's. The Church teaches that a wife must submit, must endure, must find virtue in suffering. So she endures. She stitches a scene of courtly love onto stretched linen, her needle moving with the automatic precision of years of practice. A knight kneeling before his lady in a garden of impossible roses, offering her a single perfect bloom. His face is adoring. Hers is serene. Between them, the world is beautiful and kind and orderly. Each pull of the needle through fabric is a small act of defiance, a story she tells herself about a world that does not exist and never has. The fantasy is all she has, so she embroiders it with care, adding details. A fountain, a songbird, golden thread for the lady's hair, building an architecture of lies that is more solid than the truth. Meanwhile, in the tower room where madness is kept locked away from polite society, the Lord's younger brother traces patterns on the wall with his fingernails. He has been doing this for months now, wearing grooves into stone with the patient dedication of the insane. The patterns follow some logic only he understands. Spirals and crosses and symbols that might be letters in a language he invented or remembered from fever dreams. He has been here since he returned from the Holy Land 3 years ago, speaking in tongues, seeing demons in every shadow, screaming at night about blood and sand and the faces of men he killed for God. They feed him twice daily, sliding a tray under the door and retrieving it an hour later, mostly untouched. They empty his chamber pot once a day, holding their breath against the smell. They do not let him leave. They do not speak to him beyond the necessary words, step back from the door, and put down the bowl, and he does not speak to them except in that strange language that might be Arabic or might be nothing at all. His family does not visit. His name is not spoken at meals. He exists now only in this room, in these patterns on the wall, in the sound of his fingernails scraping stone in the hours between midnight and dawn. The castle holds him the way it holds all its secrets, locked away, out of sight, slowly forgotten. The smell is what visitors never mention, what troubadours carefully omit from their songs of chivalry and courtly splendor, what merchants and pilgrims politely ignore when they arrive seeking hospitality or favor. It is the first thing that strikes you when you enter through the great doors, and the last thing you notice when you leave. A pervasive presence that becomes background, becomes normal, becomes the olfactory signature of power itself. It rises from the rushes on the floor, where bones and food scraps and dog feces decompose together into a fragrant mulch that is swept out perhaps twice a year, if the castle's chamberlain remembers, if the servants have time between their other endless duties. The rushes are meant to absorb spills and waste, to provide some cushion underfoot, but mostly they rot. They ferment. They become home to insects and mice and things that move in the dark. The smell seeps from the walls themselves, where damp and mold have created ecosystems of their own in the spaces between stone and mortar. Black blooms of fungus spread in shadowed corners. Green moss grows where condensation drips. The castle is alive in ways its builders never intended, hosting organisms that thrive in perpetual twilight, in the marriage of moisture and decay. And it emanates from the bodies of people who bathe perhaps once a month, if that, who wear wool and leather that absorb sweat and smoke and the metallic tang of blood that seems to permeate everything in this age of casual violence. There are no secrets the nose cannot detect: sickness and health, fear and arousal, the approach of death. All of it mingles in the air, becomes part of the atmosphere that everyone breathes and no one acknowledges. The castle's perfumer works constantly, desperately, burning sage and lavender in bronze censers, hanging pomanders of cloves and dried orange peel from ceiling beams, scattering rose petals across tables before feasts. But the underlying reality persists, the way stone persists beneath tapestries. This is a place where human and animal and decay exist in intimate proximity, where the boundary between the living quarters and the midden heap is thinner than anyone cares to acknowledge. The dogs sleep in the hall alongside their masters. The horses stable directly beneath the guest chambers. The dead are buried in the chapel floor, their bodies returning to earth just steps from where the living kneel to pray. In that chapel, the priest conceals his own compromises with virtue. He keeps a woman in a cottage beyond the castle walls, a widow with kind eyes and no questions, and he visits her on nights when the moon is dark and the guards are drunk enough not to notice his passage through the postern gate. He tells himself this is different from the sins he hears in confession, that his need is somehow more sanctified, more forgivable. He tells himself God understands. He baptizes children he knows were conceived in adultery, makes the sign of the cross over infants whose fathers are not the men who claim them, who stand proudly at the font while the real fathers watch from the back of the chapel or do not attend at all. He performs marriages he knows are shams, binding together people who hate each other for the sake of land or alliance or the settlement of debts. He grants absolution to men whose confessed crimes make his hands shake as he traces the sign of the cross. Murders disguised as accidents, rapes cloaked in the language of marital rights, thefts so elaborate and cruel they approach artistry. The Church teaches that all secrets will be revealed on Judgment Day, that nothing hidden will remain so when Christ returns in glory to separate the righteous from the damned. But the priest wonders sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn when he cannot sleep, if God truly wants to know everything. If divine mercy might include a certain strategic blindness, a willingness to look away from the small sins that make survival possible. He has heard confessions that would shatter kingdoms, that would unmake noble houses and redraw the maps of power. He carries this knowledge like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each passing year, and he does not know if he is serving God or simply serving silence. The castle itself seems designed for concealment. The architect who built it 3 generations ago designed rooms within rooms, passages that lead nowhere, doors that open onto solid walls. Some of this was defensive, meant to confuse invaders, to create kill zones where enemies could be trapped and slaughtered, to buy time for defenders to escape or regroup. But some of it was simply practical, an acknowledgement that any place housing hundreds of souls will need spaces for discretion, for things that happen in shadow, for the secrets that make civilization possible. There are alcoves where lovers meet who should not meet. There are storerooms where goods disappear into private hands. There are corridors where conversations happen that cannot happen anywhere else, where deals are struck and threats are made and the real business of power unfolds away from witnesses. The castle knows this. The stone remembers. And somewhere in its depths, in rooms no one has entered in decades, the walls hold their breath and wait. The castle wakes before dawn with sounds that reveal what daylight conceals. The scrape of shovels as servants clear the overnight accumulation from the stables, mucking out stalls in the pre-dawn cold, their breath visible in the air like small ghosts. The splash of slops being thrown from upper windows into the courtyard below, arcing through darkness to land with wet impacts on cobblestones already slick with waste. The wet coughing of the old knight in the east tower, a sound that has become part of the castle's morning rhythm, deep, rattling, productive coughs that bring up things better left unseen. His lungs have been rotting for months now. His chamber smells of vinegar poultices and approaching death, a sweet sour odor that clings to the tapestries and seeps into the wooden furniture. The castle physician visits him each morning, climbing the spiral stairs with his leather bag of useless remedies. He places his hand on the knight's chest and feels the heat radiating through the nightshirt, feels the crackling sensation beneath his palm like wet parchment being crumpled. He says nothing about the consumption that is slowly drowning the old man from within, filling his lungs with fluid and blood and the detritus of his own dissolving tissue. There is no cure. There is only the waiting, and the pretense that waiting is the same as hope. So the physician prescribes more poultices, more bleeding, more prayers, and the knight accepts these ministrations with the dignity of a man who knows he is already dead but must continue performing the role of the living until his body catches up with the truth. In the castle's foundation, in chambers that predate the current structure by centuries, there are bones. Not the bones of enemies or criminals, not the remains of siege victims or executed traitors, but of builders. Men who fell from scaffolding 300 years ago, their bodies broken on the stones they were raising. Men who were crushed by falling blocks of limestone, their skulls caved in, their ribs shattered, their deaths so sudden they likely never understood what was happening. Their bodies were not removed with ceremony or prayer. They were simply incorporated, folded into the castle's very substance like mortar between bricks, becoming literal foundations for the power that would be built above them. No one speaks of them now. No ceremony marks their sacrifice. No mass is said for their souls. They exist only as structural elements, as anonymous contributions to the fortress's strength, as calcium and phosphorus mixed into the earth beneath the flagstones. The current lord walks above them daily, his boots clicking on floors that contain the mineral remnants of forgotten men, and he has no idea that his sovereignty rests partly on unmarked graves. That every step he takes treads on someone who died to make this place possible. The castle's true power lies not in its military might but in its capacity for silence. The kitchen boy who sees the cook adding ground glass to a rival's stew learns to look away, to focus very intently on the onions he is chopping, to develop a sudden and absolute blindness to what his eyes have just witnessed. The chambermaid who discovers the lady's abortifacient herbs hidden beneath the floorboards, pennyroyal and tansy, rue and seven, learns to forget what she found, to close the hiding place and smooth the boards and let that knowledge dissolve like salt in water until she is no longer certain she ever saw it at all. The guard who hears screaming from the tower room at midnight learns that some doors are never to be opened, some questions never to be asked. He stands at his post and listens to sounds that make his stomach turn, and he does nothing. He tells himself he heard nothing. He tells himself the wind plays tricks in these old walls. This discretion is taught through example, through lessons written in disappearance and silence. The servant who talked too freely about what she saw in the Lord's chamber is sent away one morning, transferred to a distant estate or perhaps to nowhere at all. The stories vary, and no one asks for clarification. The priest who heard too much in confession is quietly reassigned to a rural parish 3 days' ride away, his replacement arriving before anyone realizes the first one is gone. Anyone who mistakes their knowledge for power learns quickly that knowledge without position is not power at all. It is simply vulnerability with a clearer target on its back. The castle keeps its secrets the way it keeps its stones, layer upon layer, pressed together under the weight of centuries, each generation adding its own concealed truth to the foundations. The affair that was never spoken of becomes a whisper, becomes a rumor, becomes nothing at all. The murder that was never investigated becomes an accident, becomes a tragedy, becomes a footnote, becomes forgotten. The child who was born and died in the same night becomes a story that was never told, a life that left no record, an absence that no one acknowledges, because to acknowledge absence you must first admit there was presence, and some things are easier if they never existed at all. The whole structure becomes a monument to all the things that must never be spoken aloud. And the silence holds. Generation after generation. The silence always holds. Until, perhaps, it doesn't.